Hi, my name is Julian Chambliss. I'm professor of English and the Val Behrman Curator of History at the MSU Museum at Michigan State University. The title of my presentation is Recovering Black Speculative Space, the Legacy of Black Speculative Practice and Freedom in Eatonville, Florida. I want to start with a quote from Zora Neale Hurston. I was born in a Negro town. I do not mean by that the Black backside of an average town. Even Florida is and was at the time of my birth a pure Negro town, charter, mayor, council, town marshal. This quote is from Hurston's Dust Tracks on the Road, and it calls attention to the centrality of Eatonville to Hurston's work. And because of that, I think it's an important place to start, because at some level, Hurston's emphasis on Eatonville calls our attention to the incredible power of the Black speculative practice that was formative in the town and how she was shaped by it. Her emphasis on celebrating the uniqueness of Blackness is really a direct inheritor of a culture created by this Black municipality. There is a question that we can ask related to Afrofuturism. How exactly does that framework align with Black speculative practice in terms of community building? Well, I think when we look back at the original essay where Mark Derry coins the term Afrofuturism, he says that African-American voices have other stories to tell about culture, technology, and things to come. And indeed, I think that's very true. In recent years, cultural theorists and Afrofuturists like Ronaldo Anderson have argued that Afrofuturism is really about overlapping tropes of science fiction history, trauma, reparation politics. This allows for us to understand the Black experience. And Anderson puts a special emphasis on the fact that how Afrofuturism is theorized and practiced depends very much on what the local population is dealing with. In a similar vein, Kojo Oshun, one of the earliest and most important theorists of Afrofuturism, in his essay, Further Consideration of Afrofuturism, talks about Afrofuturism should be categorized as a program of recovering a history of counterfutures created in a century hostile to Black people. And that within that space, there is critical work of manufacturing tools capable of intervention being done. And we use these sort of ideas. Oshun in particular talks about the way that the future is actually a set of intersecting narratives that create a kind of predictive practice. So this future industry that he outlines calls our attention to the ways that technoscience, fictive media, technological projection, and market prediction create a kind of control through prediction. And so the power represented by future-oriented narratives that exclude African Americans and other marginalized groups is all encompassing. I mean, it really does take what he characterized as a museological turn to see a way past this predictive narrative. In this way, we can think about reassessing the construction of Black towns through a critical Afrofuturist framework that asks us to rethink what Black space is actually facilitating for African Americans at the time and places that they were being created, and they're striving to sustain them. I think this is incredibly important in the context of Eatonville, because that's the first incorporated municipality in the United States, or one of the very first. You see African Americans surveying the landscape in the post-Reconstruction United States and seeking ways to sustain themselves that directly intersect with those areas of the future industry that Kojo Oshun calls our attention to. Now, we can only really see this in part because with new tools in digital humanities and new records being digitized all the time, there is a way for us to see institutions, individual organizations, and a digital public record that for decades has been obscure to us. In the case of places like Eatonville and other Black towns, their early history is an incredibly pivotal moment where we can see them creating structures and practices that I think still hold important clues to how African Americans conceptualize and pragmatically engage with the problem of systemic anti-Blackness. So when we look at this newly recovered digital public record, an example of it would be like the Eatonville Speaker, where we can see the sort of story of Eatonville being told by the town fathers to an audience both local and national. Here, the presence of the sort of benefactor white figure, Lewis Lawrence, who was a pivotal figure because he was willing to purchase land in an area in Central Florida where white people were resistant to selling to African Americans, and using that land in turn to create an African American community, was part of his paternalistic vision for what historian Scott French talked about as a harmonious class stratified society. And indeed, J.E. Clark, the sort of leading figure promoting the town of Eatonville in this pivotal period of the 1890s and early 20th century, talked very openly about him, Lewis Lawrence, as an important figure. But very quickly, when we look very closely at this narrative, it really evolves to one of autonomy and security being offered by the creation of a Black space. And indeed, the masthead says, the colored people of the United States saw the great race followed by securing a home in Eatonville, Florida. And they call attention to the fact that there are no white people here. But it would be, I think, a mistake when we look very closely at the record to say that it's simply self-isolation that provides security. In fact, what people in Eatonville seem to be articulating through practice and through ideology is a way of constructing an engine that will allow for them to see their way forward into a more productive future. We can see this both in terms of how they articulate their relationship to key figures of the period, like a Booker T. Washington. People in Florida, as historian David Jackson talks about, saw themselves as constructionists, creating mechanisms whereby they could act effectively in response to white racism. In particular, Washington celebrated Eatonville for its industrious, economic, social, and political activism. And that really can play itself out across a number of institutions that were constructed in the town. Again, when we think about this future industry within that space, especially within a space of market predictions and technological projections, places like Eatonville were important spots where African Americans could think through the ways that they can improve their economic and social landscape. In particular, the Robert Hungerford Industrial and Normal School, which was founded by Tuskegee graduate R.C. Calhoun, was a destination for African Americans across the state who wanted to get education, as well as for people in Eatonville. This was a school where the ideas of industrial education were clearly a part of the curriculum, but as they so rightly point out in the paperwork that they published and reports, it's a mistake to believe that it's simply work that defines the educational and ideological landscape of the Hungerford School, or really any industrial school. In fact, the course of study emphasized a kind of balance that will allow for African Americans to see their way into a more prosperous future. We can see this also in the way that Eatonville became a destination for conferences and meetings with African Americans, both for private institutions and for governmental agencies, designed to allow for them to think through ways to modernize the agrarian machine and agrarian practices that they employed in the city or in the town. Ultimately, the impact of Eatonville as a space of transformation remains a cogent part of how people in the city identify and think about themselves even today. That ideology plays itself out in organizations like the Association to Preserve Eatonville Community, which was created in response to the possibility that Eatonville might have a public works project that disrupted the town and celebrates the work of their famous daughter, Julian Hurston, but in fact is an organization dedicated to longstanding practices of education, longstanding practices of agrarianism, longstanding practices of cultural relevancy related to Blackness. But it's merely a festival that people outside the town know about. Indeed, working with the Eatonville and seeing the more complex narratives that are articulated through institutional bodies within the town and revealing sets of common communications represented by publications that are increasingly becoming available through the digital public record, make it clear that for African Americans in this period, Black Town offered a space where they could analyze and theorize about ways that African Americans might define citizenship on their terms in the United States. Often, because of the nature of the models that they were following, they put a lot of emphasis on material citizenship that differs slightly from ideological citizenship that would be in vogue later. But I think the legacy of Black speculative practice in Eatonville remains an important model that may, in fact, inspire contemporary people to rethink how they approach their questions of community, safety, and prosperity for the future. Thank you.